Greetings everyone, this is Mark Kenoyer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm really happy to be here today, and sorry I can't be here in person. I hope I can log in a bit later and join the conversation and answer some questions. Today I want to especially thank Dr. Ute Franke and Dr. Prabhakar for the invitation, and also to Arwa for organizing this session. I also need to thank the Department of Archaeology and Museums, Government of Pakistan, the Archaeological Survey of India, Ministry of Heritage and Culture Oman, and all the members of the Harappa Archaeological Research Project, as well as numerous colleagues and students for sharing their data and knowledge. Funding sources include various organizations, which I won't go into detail, but I especially want to thank harappa.com for all their support over the years, and Omar Khan, who runs the site. The Harappa project, it had many different members over the many years that we've conducted excavations. Today's presentation, I'm going to focus a lot on Harappa, so I really want to thank all of the team members, especially Dr. Meadow, who was a co-director after the death of Dr. Dales, and Barbara Dales for her help during the project. There are many other people I can't go into detail, but they include colleagues from India, Pakistan, Oman, various other countries as well. Today I'm going to focus on the issue of Indus Socio-Economic, political, and ideological organization. And as we all know, since we don't read the Indus script, the only way we can understand this is through the archaeological remains and using rigorous methodologies and interpretive frameworks. Some of these have been very clearly articulated in my articles. Others are a bit more vague because we don't have as much data as we would like. But today I'm going to try to present some framework for looking at the development of Indus cities and the important socioeconomic organization of these settlements. I focus mainly on artifact technology, which provides insights into trade networks, socioeconomic organization, and also through the hierarchies of materials that can be linked to status and wealth. And I link these to status and wealth based on studies of ethnoarchaeological work, which is done in India and Pakistan and other parts of the world. I've published this extensively. I'm not going to go into all the details in the presentation, but I will highlight some of the major points. I also want to focus a little bit on chronological patterning, because this provides insights into continuities and discontinuities related to ideology and sociopolitical interactions. So as we see changes over time, we can identify these as relating to fluctuating forms of political organization and ideas of ideology. I use the study of artifact shapes, styles, raw material, and their use, and eventually discard. And I feel that these provide insight into socioeconomic hierarchy, as well as degrees of integration compared to diversity and heterogeneity within a site or between sites. Today's discussion will focus primarily on data from Harappa, with selected other Indus settlements to provide some comparisons of what we've been finding at the site of Harappa. Settlement organization and site patterning is what I'll start with. Then I'll focus on some different ornaments, a little bit of pottery, and end with burials, and some strontium isotope analysis of individuals from Harappa. Most of you probably are already familiar of the chronology that I've developed for Harappa. I won't go into this in great detail, but I plead with everyone to stop using the term mature Harappan, because it doesn't mean anything, and it is not a term that I support anymore. I was the one who actually promoted it originally, but I really don't think it's a useful term. We have early Harappan, which falls during the regionalization era. And within the early Harappan, we have two phases, the Ravi phase and the Kote Diji phase at Harappa, and we have multiple other phases in other regions. And Jim Schaefer has presented a very good summary of those different phases. For the integration era, we basically have the Harappa phase, and that can be divided into three subphases, 3A, 3B, 3C, and I'll talk a little bit about them in different parts of the talk. We also have the localization era, which I won't go into today, which is the late Harappa phase, which has several different subphases at Harappa, period 4 and period 5. At Harappa, the Ravi phase, period 1, is divided into two segments, period 1A and 1B. 1A is primarily with hand-formed pottery. 1B is where we start seeing a bit of wheel-made pottery in the transition to different types of designs that lead up into the Cotesian. One of the most important features of the Ravi phase that we've discovered at Harappa is the development of north-south orientation of houses, and also the ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 bricks, which are key to identifying urbanism or urban architecture during the Harappa phase. And one of the recent discoveries through continued analysis, originally I thought that the Ravi phase was only in the darkened area here, or the green area, but because of new analysis of pottery that we found at different parts of the site, we now have Ravi pottery that is found in the lowest levels all the way to the eastern edge of Mound E, which suggests that probably by period 1B, the Ravi phase settlement had expanded over a very large area. Originally I thought that was only the Cotesian phase, but it's actually the Ravi phase we have is this area. So this probably started on this mound and spread to another area, split in half, and divided into two separate mounds at the last phase of the Ravi period. Then eventually we see a walled city developing during the Cotesian phase. The Ravi phase is really important because it shows that Harappa was connected to a huge network of resource areas and probably other sites, as I'll show with relating to shell, during this period, which dates to possibly 3700 as late down to around 2800 BCE. We know from settlement surveys that were done by Dr. Mogul and Rita Wright and colleagues that she was working with the Department of Archaeology, that there are many other sites around Harappa that relate to the early phase during the Cotesian, and we know that from excavations at the site of Rajanpur, which is 77 kilometers northeast of Harappa, that we have Ravi occupation in this area. Jalilpur is to the south, and this shows a very important distribution of sites around Harappa, where Harappa would be the central site, and these are other settlements around Harappa which demonstrate at least two-level hierarchy of sites during the Ravi phase. These sites would have been linking the Harappa to resource areas such as Mohmand and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa to the north, and then probably also to sites in Rajasthan and Haryana to the east. The important feature of the Cotesian period, which follows, is that we see the settlement expanding to over 27 hectares, so a bit larger. And it's at this time that we start seeing clear evidence of north-south streets with walls settling, organizing the settlement and surrounding the settlement. Now, we don't know that whether or not there was a Ravi phase wall. We haven't found it, but we do know that there's a Cotesian wall, and this was found underneath mound, the major wall that Wheeler excavated on Mound AB, and we found the edges of it on Mound E, so we know that both mounds were walled, which can demonstrate beginnings of control and economic control over these settlements. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have walled settlements right next to each other if they're used for fortification, but it does make sense for it being used for economic control. So this suggests that there is a beginning of segregation and differentiation between two settlements that are right next to each other. We also have evidence of layout of settlements with north-south orientation, this is the Ravi phase street, and houses on either side of it, and we have evidence for the similar kind of patterning on the eastern edge of Mound E. Comparing Harappa to Mohenjo-Daro, we have plans that were made by Wheeler. We have the Italian-German team that mapped the site more extensively, and in my opinion, most of these areas were also walled based on the corings done by the Italian teams. They identified these structures as platforms. I would argue that they are walls because of the comparison to what I've seen at Harappa. There's also a wall all the way around this so-called Citadel Mound that was cleared and identified by the German team. Ute Franke was very much involved in this. She may be able to comment on it, but this is a clear evidence of a wall around this settlement. Excavations by Wheeler and the pottery that Alcock published in our Dales and Kenoyer volume on pottery shows that the earliest levels at Mohenjo-Daro had Cotedigian level pottery, Cotedigian style pottery. Not a whole lot has been made of this because they were not in color and people didn't really identify them as that, but these are definitely Cotedigian potsherds. Subsequently, I was able to locate, with the help of Richard Meadow, corings from the HR area done by Dales, and in the very lowest levels of his corings, we have numerous samples of Cotedigian pottery. So this is clear evidence that there's a Cotedigian mound here, there's a Cotedigian mound at least in HR area, and probably in the entire area of the so-called lower town, which would make it comparable to what we see at Harappa. So we have an expansion. Now we should probably also find pre-Cotedigian or equivalent of Ravi levels at Mohenjo-Daro, but we have not found that pottery yet. So comparing to Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, these cities were developing over a long period of time. They were not all of a sudden laid out on the plain. They were the result of gradual development over hundreds of years, possibly 1,000 years. Dolavira also has an early Harappan component. It's a smaller area that's been exposed, but there's a stage 1 which shows a Cotedigian level periods at the site of Dolavira. Moving from settlement organization and development to ornaments, I find that ornaments provide a really good picture to understand how symbols were used to identify gender, wealth, ethnicity, and status. And these are examples of some of the Ravi phase ornaments showing what I would argue as high status materials compared to low status materials, terracotta beads compared to lapis and carnelian and jasper, and figurines from the later Harappa period which show the continuation of this type of style in later times. I want to jump a little bit back to the earliest types of studies that I had done on materials, which is shell. And in the earliest work that I worked on with Mehergarh, we found that a lot of the shell at Mehergarh was coming from distant areas along the coast, which suggests that their trade networks were linking coastal regions to the inland areas. But at this time, at the very early phases in Mehergarh, they were done with finished objects. So finished ornaments were being traded inland and reaching the site. We also have lapis, we have turquoise, and probably carnelian coming up there as well. And some of the shell may have come from across the Gulf in what would have been Oman today. And this is something that we're still investigating, but it would suggest that there's sea trade developing during that early phase or Ravi phase of the settlement. The materials from Mehergarh are really important because they show long-distance interaction between the inland coastal areas and highland regions, beginning at possibly as around 7,000 if the early dates still stand. And this includes different types of materials, both shell, turquoise, lapis, etc. being used. An important new discovery basically is it's not new discovery, but new understanding is the presence of shell from the coast of the Indus at the burial in Sarazm, of the so-called princess of Sarazm. So these are bangles made of turbinella which are from the coastal areas of Pakistan, and they are found 15 kilometers inland from the site of Shahi Tump, where identical bangles have been found. So the presence of these bangles with this burial, which she also has lapis and turquoise, lapis and carnelian, as well as fired steatite, indicate trade networks linking further into Central Asia beyond Badakhshan and linking the coastal areas of the Indus to these highland areas. But what's even more important is that this female the DNA has been analyzed, and based on the work of Narasimhan et al., 80% of her DNA links to local communities in northern and central Asia, but 20% of it links to the single example of Harappan DNA that's been found from Rakhigarhi, which suggests that she may be a second generation descendant of somebody who was from the Indus Valley. Whether it was her mother or her father, we don't know, but this indicates long-term links to the Indus Valley, from the Indus Valley to Central Asia, and associated with ideology of use of bangles and the use of a specific type of bangle, which is Turunalapirum. What's even more interesting is that Shahi Tump, which has numerous bangles excavated by the French Archaeological Mission, you have the bangles like the ones from Sarazm, you have gauntlet-type bangles that are also found there, you have an example of that gauntlet type also at Harappa. And I didn't know this until I started looking at the material found in Shahi Tump, but this bangle fragment was found during the excavations by Vats at Harappa. I analyzed it during my dissertation. I thought it was a reused piece of shell that had been repaired, and I had no idea that it was a bangle. But it clearly is identical to the bangles from Shahi Tump, and it probably relates to the Ravi phase. So it was something that was curated at Harappa or found in Ravi levels by Vats, but he didn't identify them. And this indicates that Harappa, connected to the coast, to the Shahi Tump, to Central Asia, we have a huge network linking the use of shell and a specific type of shell and ornaments at this early time period. So these networks suggest that the movements of peoples from different regions, from Central Asia to the Indus, and vice versa, provided a very important linkage across great distances and also shared ideologies over large areas. And this is what eventually we can identify in the use of bangles during the Ravi phase at Harappa, also the beginnings of the use of the swastika, possibly, the beginnings of graffiti and writing, and then also the use of ornaments such as carnelian and lapis as status items compared to smaller materials made of terracotta, which would have been locally made. In terms of the bangle tradition in the Ravi phase, we have the wide bangles, plus that gauntlet, and thin bangles. And I argue that the use of these different sizes of bangles reflects status of women or men who are wearing them and their activities, meaning labor or lack of labor. Because if you're trying to do heavy labor with thin bangles, they tend to break. So I would argue that the people who wear thin bangles were probably not doing as much heavy labor as people who were using wider bangles. You can look also at the pottery, and the pottery that we start seeing in the Ravi phase, although it's all hand-built, has some of the same features that we see later on, pedestal vessels, various elaborately decorated painted vessels, as well as plain ware, and then cooking pots, which are the carinated cooking pots that become associated with Indus-style cooking traditions. The use of ornaments, different types of drilling techniques, the beginnings of glazed theatite, and the beginnings of faience, all of these things occur during the Ravi phase at Harappa. They can be compared with what was happening at Mehergarh and studied by the French mission, and then later also at Nausharo. What we've been able to do at Harappa with the carnelian, for example, with the help of Randall Law and Laura Dusubiot, is the LAICPMS analysis of carnelian. So these carnelian fragments and bead fragments from Harappa are all associated with sources in Gujarat. This shows a very distinctive source region that is linking this area to the coast of Gujarat, and identical types of pecked beads are being found in Gujarat, which raises the question of how did people in Harappa begin to learn how to make pecked carnelian beads since there's no carnelian in the Punjab? And my current feeling is that there probably is a movement of people, craft specialists from Gujarat into the Punjab at this time, which would have been brought with them the technique of pecking beads and also the use of carnelian, and then linking them to the sources of carnelian. So people at Harappa did not invent pecking of carnelian beads, but people in Gujarat, where the beads are present, probably were the ones who developed that early technology. How do we prove this? We need more research, more excavations, more detailed analysis of materials, and I think eventually, hopefully getting some DNA will show that some of the people are probably actually moving from Gujarat into this region to the north, and probably all along this area of the Indus and Saraswati Valley. Just back to the bangles again, we see the wide bangles from Harappa. We also have them from Ganvedivala repaired. This was found on the surface, so we assume it's from the Harappan phase, but it could be from the earlier period, which I think there's an earlier mound at Ganvedivala. And then we can compare it ethnographically to the way that women wear bangles today in South Asia. So moving to the Kotdiji phase, we start seeing the development of early writing out of the earlier Ravi phase writing to the Kotdiji early Indus script. We have the development of seals for stamping clay, and then cubical weights that conform to the standard that we see later in the Indus. Beginnings of the use of lots of, or beginnings of gold, and then at sites such as Kunal, we have also the use of silver. These are ornaments that would have been worn as symbols of status and power and hierarchy within this time period. We also see evidence for textiles, and I won't go into the details, but we have different types of spindle whorls, and then we have depictions of textiles on painted figurines. And also the continued use of bangles and ornaments, and then tika head hair ornaments. So basically during the Kotdiji phase, there's increased evidence for shared ideologies across a huge region of the Indus. And one of those shared ideologies relates to, I think, cooking, because we start seeing a very standardized form of cooking vessel found in Kotdijian sites throughout the Indus, and this continues on into the Harappan and late Harappan period. And I'm just going to throw this in as a possibility that we also found one sherd from Oman, from the site of Salut, that looks like it might be a Kotdijian grooved vessel, which suggests that there may be continued trade across the Gulf, and that people from the Indus may have come here, or the style of this grooved vessel may have been copied in this region. And this suggests that the region of Oman also needs to be taken into account when we talk about the early phases and the early stages of the Indus. So right now I'm thinking that there are at least 10 different regional cultures that are providing not only materials, but the movement of peoples from, for example, Gujarat to the Punjab, as well as other regions. And with these movements, you're having a shared ideology and shared technology spreading over a huge area. And Oman, I think, should be considered as a part of it, because Oman and Makran are definitely part of this network. So the integration era sees the emergence of very important urban centers. We know the major ones in Harappa, Rakhigarhi, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, and possibly Ganvedivala. There are other larger sites such as Lakhanjo-daro near Mohenjo-daro. We have Juderjo-daro, we have Lahomjo-daro. There are many more sites in Sindh that have not been explored properly that we still need to investigate. These settlements, I think, provide clear evidence for regional variation within different craft materials, regional differences in settlement organization, which I'll talk about briefly, and then also regional diversity in ornament styles, figurines, the use of figurines, and then as people like Greg Jameson have done, he's demonstrated that there are different areas that were producing seals, and also trading seals between major cities. Harappa, for example, has evidence for seal production in numerous of the parts of the site, and these were all walled. So we have walls around Mount E, Mount AB, Mount F, Mount ET, Mount HT probably, and no wall yet that has been found around area J or the areas outside to the west of the mountain. But we have people living outside the site. We have people living outside the gateways. We have cemeteries outside the gateways. So the development of these settlements is quite complex and something that was not understood by earlier excavators. In our work, we were able to identify several gateways, which show that the gateways were very restrictive. These were walls were built that were intended to cover new areas or areas outside of the mound that had not been incorporated before. This large curved wall, I think, was probably used to incorporate a market area that may have grown outside of the Cotedigian period wall, which we haven't found, but it had to be there because we have it from one side of the site. There's no Cotedigian wall under this Harappan wall. So this means that this wall was built and expanding over a new area outside of the area of the earlier Cotedigian settlement. And these streets, even though they were north-south during the Cotedigi phase, the Cotedigi wall may have been in here, we just haven't found it. This is expanding and making it a larger area. We know that they're restrictive because we can define how big of a passageway it was. And this is a modern cart, which is what ancient Harappans would have been using. And it's basically the width of this gateway. So one cart can come in, one cart can go out. There's no two-way traffic coming in and out of the city. And most of the gateways of Harappa, the ones that we found, are all this narrow gateway. Whereas the interior streets are much wider and allow a larger movement of goods inside the city. Within these walled areas, we also see evidence for high-level crafts such as faience and steatite tablet workshops. This is from period 3B, which we found on the edge of Mound E, and earlier Harappan houses from 3A. They would have had fired brick superstructures, but they have mud brick foundations, which indicates the architectural tradition of fired brick being used starting from 3A. All of these later buildings were robbed, but we have a clear pattern and bonded. Some of the bricks are bonded, and we can see where the wall voids were, so we know that they were fired brick rooms. This is examples of some of the faience from this workshop, which actually started out as a bead workshop, but then developed into a seal and tablet workshop during the 3B period. We can also see the expansion of settlement. So we have, this is the old city wall for Mound E. We have evidence of people living outside of this area before the construction of this wall. And then eventually this wall was built to incorporate and surround this new settlement, or people living outside the wall. And right inside the gateway we have evidence for craft areas that were clearly associated with access to the gateway and ability to control production of materials in this area. The same types of crafts that we find here were found in Mound E, they're found in Mound AB, they're found in Mound F, which indicates that each of the walled areas of Harappa have replicative forms of crafts that were used to cater to the people in those parts of the settlement. And at the same time, we can track materials made in one workshop and see that they're actually found in other parts of the mound. So these people were not isolated from each other, they were integrated, they were moving back and forth, but they were also segregated to some extent through the control of production areas. So citizens would have contributed, I think, to the maintenance of the city walls, whether through corvée labor or direct forms of taxation. They would have contributed to cleaning out the drains. But in some of the neighborhoods, we see evidence for no cleaning of the city and drains filling up with dirt and garbage and for 1 meter of deposit occurring in some areas. So at some points of time, the city was actually not being maintained in different neighborhoods, whereas in other neighborhoods, they were being cleaned. So this should suggest that there's a lot of political variation going on and a lot of probably back and forth between rulers about who gets to get what benefit from the taxes. And over time, we see streets being repaired, new drains being put in. So things were fluctuating back and forth in these large settlements. People who lived here would have had to conform to some aspects of India's ideology and fit within a hierarchical social and economic system. And we see concentrations of weights and seals near the gateways, and some houses inside the city that have no evidence for use of writing, and right next to them houses that have evidence of writing, which suggests that some people in the city did not use writing or were not concerned with it. whereas other people did, and it shows diversity within the city of people with access to the tools for control and enforcement of different types of economic and ideological forms. Now, Harappa is very different from what we see, and probably Mohenjo-Daro is very different from what we see at Dolavira. The layout of the settlement is totally different. There's a very restrictive access to a small part of the settlement, which has been called the castle. And while I argue that big cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were probably ruled by corporate rulers, by different communities competing for power, Dolavira to me looks like it may have been controlled by a single family, a ruling family, maybe a hereditary ruling family, maybe a so-called king or queen, and organized very differently than other Harappan cities. But the material culture is very similar. So this suggests that the organization of urban settlements, the political organization of the Indus as a whole, shows regional variation and diversity, and settlements in Gujarat, for example, seem to conform to the style that we see at Dolavira. So I argue that Indus cities were heterogeneous and hierarchically organized in order to integrate communities from diverse backgrounds and geographical regions. And this process began long before the urban phase, but new features can be seen during the urban period of 2600 to 1900 BC. What these settlements did provide was an urban center that had provided clean, well-organized, safe places to live, safe places to carry out trade and to practice one's ideology, without a rigorous control of what ideology we're practicing. Because within the city we see multiple areas with different styles of objects within, which indicate that people probably had the ability to practice different things as long as they conformed to the rigorous control of access into and out of the settlement, which would have been reinforced by the people using seals. We know that there's a hierarchy of settlements, with large settlements, Grakigari being possibly the largest, and other sizes going down to 1 hectare, which we have at the smaller level. We're going to talk about one of those settlements in a bit later. As I mentioned earlier, compared to Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, sites in Gujarat tend to have this very restrictive wall, even though some people were living outside the settlement. There may have been 2 walls around Shikarpur. We have Goladoro or Bagasara, and then we have Dolavira. So what this means, which suggests to me, is that the regions of Gujarat and this southwestern area, or southeastern area of the Indus, the western area of India, has very different settlement pattern and site organization than what has been seen in the bigger centers in the Indus Valley. What the communities did share, however, was a wide variety of staple goods, which could be traded between the cities. I think Jennifer Bates and Marco Medella talked about this in their presentation. We have a diversity of cooking traditions and food preparation and spices, which I argue would reinforce the idea of diversity and hierarchies within the cities. Not everybody was eating the same thing, but they had a large range of things which they could choose from. And this, again, reinforces the concept of diversity within the city, and also probably hierarchy within the settlements. We know that there were similarities in certain styles of pottery, but not everybody had the same style of pottery, and not everybody was probably drinking the best quality of beer. These are containers for straining and preparing beer. We do have cooking pots that everyone has, but my earlier ideas that we should see styles of cooking pots that pattern within the city did not pan out. We analyzed cooking pots at Harappa very carefully. But all the different styles of rims are found scattered everywhere in the settlement, and no one neighborhood has just one style of cooking pot. So what that suggests to me is that whatever these rim styles and painted forms represent, people were using different styles at different points of time in different neighborhoods, and either that is a large group of diverse people living next to each other, or that this vessel had no symbolic meaning at all. I tend to go with the first interpretation, that the cooking pots did have a meaning and that the color of the rim did mean something, but the fact that we don't find a very rigid pattern of them indicates that Indus cities were not divided into very distinct ethnic neighborhoods, but that people were using their own style of pot, but many people of different groups were living next to each other. So this is an example of metal cooking pots. Not everyone would have had bronze cooking vessels. So this definitely indicates elite groups of people who would have access to metal. And then we have different styles of vessels with red, with black, with one band, with two bands, with different ridges, which indicate that these potters were making distinctive styles of vessels for a wide range of clientele. But everyone cooked similar types of food. And then when we get to Oman, we start seeing identical types of cooking pots being made in Oman, probably by Indus potters, for people in Oman who wanted to eat with Indus-style cooking vessels, be served on Indus-style pedestal vessels, and we have trade metal containers coming to Oman from the Indus Valley. We don't know what they contained. Aksheta has identified possible date residues in one, but then we don't know if those dates were from Makran, which is famous for its dates, or whether they were local dates that were being processed and that was being used for storage here. So these are things that we still need to figure out in future research. Another type of ornament are fans and glazed steatite. So this is something that we see rapidly developing. We saw it at the beginning of it during the Ravi phase. We see it in much more elaborate forms during the Kotdiji phase. And during the Harappa phase, we have an explosion of variety of glazed steatite, glazed fans with different colors. And this continues on into the late Harappan. So what these reflect to me are, catering to more diverse needs of elite communities within the city, and craftspeople being, urged to make new forms of materials so that people can differentiate themselves. So this high variety of fans reflects that aspect of Indus urbanism. We also know that there were changing styles over time, and I'm not going to go into the changes in the faience ornaments, but a very good example are seals. So the earliest seals from the Indus tend to be right-facing, except for one seal from the Kotdiji phase, which was left-facing. So left-facing seal during the Kotdiji phase, right-facing seal during the period 3A, and then left-facing seals during period 3B. Now, there are some variations and there are some exceptions to this rule, but as Ayumu Konosukawa has pointed out, this is an important pattern that we need to try to understand. So these are period 3A beads, seals, and then 3B seals. And during 3B, we see clear evidence of Indus people using Indus writing, interacting with people who did not use writing. So Bactrian traders were coming to Indus cities with their seals. They did not adopt Indus writing system. So people chose not to use writing in certain communities. And I think within the Indus itself, we probably had many communities who did not want to use writing and did not use it for ideological purposes. And we also see during 3B the first use of seals with just writing on them. So no image of an animal, especially not the unicorn. And then we see variations of this in the Gulf, where we have people using Indus-style seals, but Indus writing, but for probably different languages. So again, many different communities using forms of technologies relating to control, but using it in different ways for their own purposes and probably competing for power within this very complex social and economic context. By 3C, we start seeing a very formal distinction between Indus use of seals. So some seals are rectangular with just writing, and the writing is clearly being developed with new signs based on studies by Vahia Nisha Yadav. So this is the writing system has evolved, and we also see the style of writing changing. So now it's very regular on the seals, and it's not oriented in various ways over the unicorn. It's very, very uniformly presented. Similarly, we have that found both on unicorn seals as well as on seals without unicorns or without animals. And the use of writing on pointed base goblets indicates that writing was also being used as a way to certify certain types of activities that were happening in the city. So if you were having a special festival, you had pointed base goblets made and then stamped with your seal. These were made for specific uses. We have an example of a stamped goblet fragment found from the site 1 day's walk from Harappa that was discovered by Rita Wright. So people were coming to the big cities, they were enjoying these functions, they were taking home mementos, indicating that the cities themselves were places where people came and went, but when they came, they participated within the urban structure that was established within the walled areas. We also see the beginnings, or the important elaboration, I should say. It starts actually during 3A, but the elaboration of narratives on seals. So these are narrative seals with 4 different sides and multiple stories being told, combined together, that would have been used, I think, as a form of demonstration of certain types of ritual activities happening at the site. We have multiple examples of these made. So a potter would be asked, or a seal maker would be asked to make 50 of these seals, or tablets with the same seal, and then somebody who controlled that would have taken those and used them and distributed them amongst people at the settlement. We have examples of identical impressions from Harappa also found at Mohenjo-Daro, which means that people were interacting between these big cities, sharing some aspects of ideology, and sharing the similar types of tablets that were being used to commemorate certain events. Now, it could have been trade, it could have been rituals that were bringing people together, but in some contexts, we have very strong evidence for certain communities being involved in these types of activities. I always talk about beads, so I'm going to include a few examples of beads. I won't go into detail, but the development of Indus bead technology is something that I spent a long time working on with my colleagues. And we know that during the Harappa phase, there's a high variety of ornaments being produced. And they really liked certain designs, they liked certain materials. They made specialized decorative bleached carnelian beads. And they also made these distinctive, very long biconical beads that were used in belts. There are only 3 belts found in the entire Indus civilization complete. And yet, many of these beads were then traded from the Indus to areas outside the Indus and used singly or sometimes repaired and reground in different areas and actually passed down for almost 1,000 years. In the Indus, these big belts were found at Mohenjo-Daro, and we have examples of belt components at Harappa. But we also have a belt found at the site of Al-Ladino. Now, Al-Ladino is a dinky little site, maybe 1 hectare in area, located on the coast near the delta of the Indus, and yet an entire belt of this form was found buried in a small pot in the edge of the site underneath the floor. So this indicates that some elites probably had country estates, and they may have lost favor in the big cities and moved to these estates, eventually told to come back for some kind of consultation, but never came back home, and that jewelry was left in this little site of Al-Ladino. I was just at Al-Ladino this summer excavating with a Pakistan team from the Department of Archaeology, Government of Sindh, and we're hoping to try to find a bit more out about the sites because it was never fully published by Fair Service. This is the site of Al-Ladino. This is what was excavated by Fair Service. In this little room up here, they found evidence for a little pot buried in the ground, which is the vessel. And in that vessel was this entire hoard of jewelry: silver, toe rings, necklaces, gold fillets, gold, recycled gold, lots of beads, and a complete belt with bronze beads. So this is an example of what I would argue is a very elite person who was probably hereditary elite, who could afford to collect these beads over generations. And this was taken to their private estate and eventually buried, and they never came back to pick it up. So we don't know what actually happened, but we do know that this is something that would have normally been found only in a very large city. So these are examples of the types of variation that we see between some of the large settlements and their smaller settlements. We know a lot more about beads from the Indus that have been found in other areas due to recent research done by one of my colleagues or student, Jeffrey Ludwig. He found a fragment of a long Indus bead at Troy. He found them at Aegina Colonna, found them in Tel Hesi and Gezer, at Hattusha, and other ones have been found in Abydos. I'm currently studying the beads from Kish, and these are clearly made by Gujarat carnelian, but in my analysis that I'm currently doing, which I'll talk about in more detail later, I can very clearly see that some of the beads from Kish made by Indus craftspeople were made in a very different style and size than they would have done back home. So here they are in Mesopotamia making beads for Mesopotamian elites. And I've talked about this in my other articles, but we see a variation in the style being presented here than what we'd see in the Indus. Comparing the carnelian from Harappa, during the Harappa phase, we can also see that there's new sources of carnelian being used that were not used during the Ravi phase. So during the Harappa phase, we have carnelian from Iran, we have carnelian from Gujarat, but we also have carnelian from a source that we still have not identified. And we're not sure where that is, but we're working to try to find that out. So I've talked a lot about bangles before, but I just want to reinforce this idea of hierarchy represented by different raw materials. So we have terracotta bangles, shell bangles of different sizes. We have faience, stoneware, copper, gold. People of different classes and possibly all ranges of classes were using an ornament that shared a symbolic meaning, but was made with different raw materials. And one of the most important types of bangles were stoneware. So stoneware bangles so far have only been found at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, in terms of manufacture. Examples of these have been found in Dholavira. Based on our preliminary analysis, the Dholavira bangles actually come from Mohenjo-Daro or from that same clay source, whereas the ones from Harappa, we have Harappa-made bangles, and a lot of bangles at Harappa came from Mohenjo-Daro. So Mohenjo-Daro was probably the main source of stoneware bangles, but we have them being spread out to different sites. And we can confirm this through the studies done by Massimo Vidale and Sophie Marie and Jim Blackman, and then also current work that we're doing on this, Randa Law and myself. And I'm going to end with a little discussion of the cemetery. So cemeteries have been found at many different Indus sites. At Harappa, the cemetery is located to the south of Mound AB and southwest of Mound E. But there's also a cemetery to the south of Mound ET. And we haven't found any other cemeteries in between here, but it hasn't been excavated completely. But there are no cemeteries that we can find in other areas of the site that have been studied. Occasionally we'll find skeletal materials inside the site, but no large-scale burials. Other sites, Dholavira, it's to the west, Lothal to the west, Ropar to the west. But Rakhigarhi, for some reason, the cemetery is to the north. So is this the cemetery for the main site of Rakhigarhi, or is it a cemetery for another settlement? Because Rakhigarhi is such a big site, they may have had multiple burials. So it seems unlikely that one side of the Indus had a burial cemetery to the north, whereas most of the other ones were either west or southwest. Farmana has a very distant cemetery, 900 meters to the northwest. And again, is this actually the cemetery for Farmana, or is that the cemetery for a site that has not been clearly defined up here? So Farmana Cemetery would be to the west or southwest of the site. So I'm not sure if anybody's done any studies here, but this is something that I think needs to be checked. Based on the work at Harappa, we have clear patterns of burial that we can identify, and the reuse of areas and the intensive burial, and then the removal of Harappan burials by grave diggers, probably of different classes, and then redeposited in the cemetery. So they were more interested in having their dead buried next to the ancestor, and did not seem to care whether or not that earlier burial was disturbed in order to make room for the later burial. So this is something that I presented already in a publication in 2010, and it's something that we're going to, I'm finishing now the cemetery volume where it will be detailed in more detail. We have evidence for changing bangle styles in the cemetery, linking from the earlier burials to the later burials, which indicates to me that women's status was changing over time, and that later burials, the women were less involved in manual labor than the women from the earlier phase. We also have clear evidence that most people were not buried, that they were disposed of in other ways. And this is not something that I discovered. This was mentioned by some of the earliest excavators. So everyone has been talking about this for a long time, but I don't think a lot of people have been paying much attention to it. So we need to remember that very few people of the Indus were buried, so we should not be looking for royal burials. They didn't do that. And this is a very different ideology than what we see in Mesopotamia or other regions. And even the people who were buried had very few ornaments and very few materials other than pottery included with the burials. So this is the maximum amount of gold in a Harappan burial, these 3 beads found with this male individual at Harappa. They were buried in coffins, they had shrouds, they had sometimes beads. Most burials had pottery, and they were tended to be buried north-south with a supine position. What we did do at Harappa was we were able to do the strontium isotope analysis. Now we tried for DNA back in 1988 when we first took the samples from the cemetery. We tried getting organic material for DNA analysis. The technology was not very well developed. We've re-sampled those burials, and we still have not been able to get DNA from it. Dr. Reich's lab in Harvard has been working on this, but nothing has been recovered. So people always ask me, what about the DNA from Harappa? Well, there is no DNA preserved that we can get access to. But we do have strontium. And the strontium tells us that some people at Harappa were local, and a lot of the females were local, and a lot of the males were non-local, which means males coming to the site as well as some females, and probably intermarrying with this community that buried their dead, and many of the males that were non-local were buried next to females that were local, which suggests that there may have been a matrilocal burial system, and that the females in the cemetery were more related to each other than to the males. And this is based on genetic analysis or genetic trait analysis done by the physical anthropologists, Lucas and Hemphill. So in summary, we can say that cemeteries do reflect social hierarchy and different belief systems. Most people were not buried at Harappa, but there were a lot of people who died. So where did they go? They were either cremated or they were put in a river. Only certain elite communities were buried, yet everybody at Harappa was using the same type of pottery. So those other people were also Harappans, but they didn't bury their dead in the same way as this community did. Who they were, we don't know. Probably very powerful people, landowners, traders, ritual specialists. And there is some indication that there were some hereditary linkages between the women based on genetic trait analysis, and then the cultural tradition of use of bangles and certain pottery styles. So overall, I think we can clearly confirm that Indus cities had elites. They were hierarchically organized, they were diverse, and that we had very heterogeneous populations living in these urban centers. And this can be determined based on the discussions that I've just made on technology, on ornaments, and settlement patterning itself. So I conclude by saying major advances have been made and are continuing to be made in the Indus tradition and in other periods, the late Harappan and early Harappan. And I want to recommend increased sharing of data through international seminars of this type. and also on online platforms where people can see the artifacts and the data analysis for comparison. Harappa.com is something that we've been doing this for a very long time, and I know that there's open access now with the Two Rains project and other projects, so I would just want to encourage everyone to continue to share data and to continue to be open to sharing different ideas and materials, and that's the only way we can move forward in this field. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.